When you're working in JavaScript, you're going to find yourself working with a bunch of imports and exports all the time. Anytime you need to access a piece of information that lives in a different file, you need to export it from there and then import it into the file you want to use it in. The other really common thing in JavaScript is you're often working with packages and libraries that other people have authored and then published to an online registry like, say, NPM. So you go ahead and you install their package or library from NPM into your project, and then you import the functionality into the necessary files as you need it, based on what they have provided as an export from their packages and libraries. So let's take a look at how you can do that in JavaScript and what the different techniques are and when they're applicable. There are essentially two kinds of exports in JavaScript: named exports and default exports. Let's start with default exports. Let's say you have a project and it needs a greeting text. How's it going, y'all? That you need to add in a bunch of different files because it shows up in a bunch of different areas in your project. What you can do is create a file, right, in one place, store that there, export it, and then import it into whatever file you need. That way, whenever you need to change that text, you change it in one place and it changes everywhere else, which is a pretty basic, dry development concept. So let's go ahead and do that. I've got a file called strings.js, and I'm going to create a constant in here called "how's it going, y'all?" greeting. How can I export this? It's actually really easy. In order to do an export from this file, all I have to do is at the bottom of the file go export, default, and then the value of whatever I want to export. So in this case, it's the constant greeting. Now I can go back into my original file and I can import it. So without an import, it's not going to work, right? So if I go and I console log greeting like this, there I'm going to get an error. It actually is not defined in this particular file. So in order to fix that, I need to import it. So in order to import something, you just type in the term import, and then you can give your imported functionality the name. So in this case, greeting, and then from, and then the exact path of the file that you want to import this from. So in quotes, I'm going to put in the dot, which means that it's in the current directory, slash, and then strings. And there we go. Now my console log is working and it says, "How's it going, y'all?" But here's the thing. I can call this import whatever I want. I don't have to call it greeting. So I could go and I could change this to my name, Ruba, and it still works. Why? Because a default import from a file is just the value itself. There's no specific name for it. So if I go back to my file here, I can just comment out the greeting and instead take that statement itself and put export default and then just put that string right there. And if I remove the question mark, you can see it changes. It's going to work. There is no name. It just knows that this is the main entity that we're exporting from this file, and this is its value. And then you can call it anything you need. So the variable that this information gets stored in the file that you imported in, call it whatever you want, right? So in this case, I called it Aruba. I can call it greeting, call it whatever I want. And this is really helpful. Sometimes you might have different packages and libraries, and they might all export a function, or at least one function, that is the same name. Well, if it's a situation like this, and it's a default export from those files, then you could have import greeting from strings and import greeting number 2 from someone else's strings. You give it whatever name you need in order to be able to differentiate between them, regardless of whatever name they gave in their own files and packages. So that's really helpful. But this means that right now we have to make a file per piece of information. So If I have a greeting message and I also have a goodbye message, then I have to make a goodbye.js file as well. And I don't really want to do that. It's just a piece of string. I just want to keep it all in this one strings.js file and then be able to use whatever information I need wherever I want. So that is where named exports come in handy. So let's go ahead and go back to our strings.js. In order to turn this into a named export, we can't use the default function here. So I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to bring back our original constant greeting. And at the start of that statement, I'm just going to add export. So export const greeting. How's it going, y'all? Now you can see there's a different error. The requested module does not provide an export named default. There is no default export in this file. So in order to get a named export into your file, you must use the exact name that was given in that file. So in here, we have import greeting, the same name, but because right now it's assuming that it's a default, in order to indicate that this is a named export, we have to wrap it in curly braces. And voila, now it works. So why do we need curly braces? Essentially what happens is when you're exporting a named export of any kind from the files, you can imagine that it's like an object of files, or sorry, object of values that are going to get exported from that file. So now I could go back to strings and I could export a goodbye string as well. So export const goodbye equals, if I knew how to spell goodbye, goodbye. Now, if I go back to my lesson 4 file, I can go in that curly braces area, comma, goodbye, and then get access to that goodbye string as well. So let's console that out. There we go. Our goodbye is in there as well. If I were to remove those curly braces, you can already see there's all these red lines. It's all going to break because it doesn't understand that. It's trying. If I look at it, I'm just like, what? There's more than one default export or something from a file? How can there be more than one default of anything? One default value. So there we go. That is how you do named exports. But you can actually combine these two ideas. So you can have a bunch of different named exports in a file and then also have one default export in there as well. So let's say in this project, have all these different strings, but there are new areas where we have identified that we need strings, but the copywriters haven't gotten me my information yet. So in those areas, I might want to put a placeholder for now. So I can go in here and create a const called placeholder and export that as my default. So export default placeholder. Now, inside lesson 4, I can import the named exports as well as the default. So if you have somewhere that you want to export and then import the default and the named exports of that file in the same line, you can, let's take a look at what that means in this one separate line. I can do something like this, import, placeholder from strings. And then I can console that out. And it works. But, we like dry code around here, and the idea of having two different lines of, importing something from the same file feels a little not as nice. So we can actually combine them. So I'm going to comment that out. The default import always needs to go first in the line. So I can go import and then placeholder and then comma, and then in the curly braces, whatever named exports I need. And as you can see, that still works. We have no errors. Again, if I wanted in my strings file, I didn't need to make a constant for something so simple. I could, in fact, have just done export default placeholder and it would still work. Now you can see I had those 2 exclamation marks and our console log shows the exclamation mark. The same naming situation still applies. So I could go into my lesson 4 file and then that default, I could call it Aruba. like so, and that's still gonna work. So there you have it. You have default imports and exports, and you have named imports and exports. You can combine them into one if you need, and depending on the situation or the setup, you might have one or both in any given file. Now, in this example, we worked just with constants, but in fact, you can basically export and import anything, any kind of block. So you can go into strings and we could export a function like so, my cool string, and then return. So now we're exporting this function and it is a named function. So I can actually grab this, go into lesson 4, and we can pull that in, my cool string. Now, if I go and console that out, there we go, my cool string, it works. So functions, variables, lets, all of these are exportable and importable.